You got your Bibles. Let's go back to the book of Exodus. Back to the book of Exodus for just a second. Well, if you're like me, a lot of your childhood maybe or adulthood was involved some of Bob Ross painting on PBS. And what I remember about Bob Ross painting on PBS was he would make a creation like what you see on the screen, but everything didn't go according to plan. Like he would paint, and then he would make a stroke that was too long or a color that didn't look just right. And so instead of scrapping the whole thing, what he would call it is a happy little accident, those little happy accidents. And he would brush over it or incorporate it into his painting, however it went. Well, a couple years ago, there's a documentary on Netflix about Bob Ross, and it's got an interesting part where his son, Mr. Ross, I forget his first name, but his son talks about what he learned from his dad. And here's a quote that I thought was really interesting. And this comes from a man who watched his dad make mistakes. And really one of the more famous parts of Bob Ross's lineage are the little happy accidents that he makes. But here's what his son said. He said, I've wondered sometimes if it's not your mistakes that teach you a lot more than your successes. Because after successes, he said, you just move on to the next thing. But when you make a mistake, suddenly you learn all kinds of ways to correct it. That's great. And you find out that you really start developing new ways, and you develop in new ways. And so this whole idea of mistakes leading to possible good is what we're going to play off of a little bit this morning. So we're going through 1 Corinthians, and I think what we learn in the book of 1 Corinthians is that the church and really God's people from the beginning have often been a people of mistakes, a people of sometimes repeated mistakes. For a while, they were a people of mistake after mistake after mistake after mistake, and that's what Paul in 1 Corinthians 8 will call our attention to. Over and over again, they fail, they miss the mark, and sometimes they learn. But a lot of times they've got to deal with the consequences of repeated mistake after mistake after mistake. The book of Exodus is full of them. I think we'll start in Exodus chapter 13, but let me bring you up to speed real quick. And this will be, give me 3 or 4 minutes and make it through the book of Exodus. But you can't really get what happens in 1 Corinthians 10 without what happens in the book of Exodus. So when Exodus opens, you find the people of God enslaved in Egypt. The people who were blessed by God, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, on down to Joseph, have made their way into Egypt. And this great superpower of the day has noticed that the people of God are becoming more numerous and more powerful, and they're growing because who would have guessed it? But God is blessing them, and it's working. And so they're growing in number. They're growing in prosperity. They're in the best part of the land in Goshen. And so the Pharaoh, most powerful man on the planet, says, oh, we can't have that. And so he enacts a few decrees that make life really hard for the people of God in the first 2 or 3 chapters of Exodus. Their labors are increased. Their quotas are increased. They don't get any more resources to help with the quota. And so things are really bad. Eventually, it gets worse and worse until it turns into what you would call, I think, a genocide. And so the people of God recognize what's happening, and they start to cry out to God. They want deliverance, and God hears their cries for deliverance from within Egypt. He's not just God of the one nation, he's God of the whole world. So he hears their cries from Egypt, and he's going to respond to their cries. The way that he does that is that he raises up a man named Moses. Moses meets God in the burning bush in Exodus chapter 3, and God says, Moses, you've been gone for 40 years from Egypt, you're 80 years old, but you will go and speak to my people and speak to Pharaoh and say, let my people go that they may come out and worship me. And Moses has a lot of excuses. He's got a lot of reasons why he should not do that. It'll never work, he thinks. They won't listen to me. I don't talk very well. Well, that's what Moses thinks, but God overcomes his doubts and overcomes his hesitations and says, go. And so Moses goes, and he tells the people, come out. And he tells Pharaoh, let my people go. It takes 10 plagues. Eventually, number 10 is the death of the firstborn, but eventually the people of God are on the way out. That begins in Exodus chapter 12. In Exodus chapter 13, God shows up to lead them in a cloudy pillar by day, which would have given them protection from the harsh Egyptian sun, and a fiery pillar by night, which would have probably given them light and warmth in the cold desert nights. And so God appears in a cloud by day and a fiery pillar by night. He's guiding them to where he wants them to go. He's leading them to where they need to be, out of enslavement and into a much, much better land. Already, they have tendencies to wander away from God and to doubt God and to really not listen to what God is doing for them, but God is guiding them, remaining faithful to his people. If you flip the page to the next chapter, Exodus chapter 14, you're going to find the people of God on the banks of the Red Sea, and by this time, the Egyptians have decided, no, we need them. They were a good workforce, and we didn't have to pay them, so let's go get them back. And so they chase them down to the banks of the Red Sea, and so Egypt is on Israel's tails. And now they've come to this place where water's in the front and the army's in the back. And what do we do now? And Moses says, fear not, stand firm, and see the salvation of the Lord. Before they know it, in Exodus 14, Moses has waved his staff over the land, over the waters. The waters have parted and dry ground has appeared underneath, and so they cross over, while their former enslavers are swallowed up in the sea. Exodus 15 is a song of deliverance where they celebrate God's removing them from Egypt and bringing them through the Red Sea. And then you get into Exodus chapter 16. On the other side of the Red Sea, God's people quickly become discontent with their lives. They don't have any food to eat. They don't have anything to drink. And so they assume that God has brought them out of Egypt to kill them in the wilderness because there's just not enough graves back in Egypt. That's what they think about God. But what they think about God is a total misrepresentation of who God is. That is not the God they serve. Exodus 16, God begins to feed the people miraculously every day with manna. And so every morning they wake up and there's a brand new reminder of God's constant faithfulness and care and concern and blessing on his people. That's Exodus 16. In Exodus 17, a few days later, the people are back to their complaining. They don't like that they're out there. They don't have anything to drink. And you may think that after all the events that they've just witnessed, you may think that after they've seen God's care and concern and faithfulness, that they would trust in God to provide, but they actually do the opposite. They assume, again, that God has brought them out of Egypt into this wilderness just to kill them out there. And so now they decide to stone Moses, the one that God raised up to go deliver them from Pharaoh and Egypt and their enslavement. They say, you know what? Let's do away with Moses. Let's kill him, because he just wants to kill us. Again, another misunderstanding of God and his relation to his people and his intentions for his people. They totally misunderstand God, and they totally get their lives wrong. But again, Moses strikes the rock, brings water from it to quench the thirst of his people. And so he's done great things. If you think about what God has done for his people so far, he has heard their cries. Before that, he prospered them. Then he heard their cries. Then he raised up Moses. He delivered them from the Egyptians. He passed them through the Red Sea. He guided them in the cloudy, fiery pillar. He gave them food when they were hungry, water when they were thirsty. But from the very time that God began to deliver his people, they've doubted him. From the very time people cried out for deliverance, God showed them grace and mercy, care, concern, love, providence. They are first-hand eyewitnesses to God's love and care for them as he provides for them and delivers them and guides them through the wilderness, provides food and drink, cares for them. They don't have anything that they need that God won't provide. There's not even a law yet. That comes a little bit later in Exodus chapter 20. But up until this point, all God has shown them is mercy and grace, love, compassion, and care. But that still didn't guarantee that they were going to live as God wanted them to live. Before long, the people would eventually make it to Mount Sinai. That comes in about Exodus 19, where God says, here we are. You were enslaved, I brought you out. You were suffering, but now you are my special treasured people, my kingdom of priests. I want you to go out there and live in a different kind of way than the rest of the world. And so in Exodus 20, he begins to give them laws and commandments that will set them apart and make them a holy people, distinct, different, totally different than the rest of the world. While Moses is up gathering those commandments, the people lose sight of where God is and apparently forget about the mercy and grace that God has shown them over and over and over again. And while Moses is receiving the law of God, the people begin to doubt in Exodus chapter 32. They say, Moses is gone, we got no leader, we don't know where we're supposed to go, and so let's make us an idol for ourselves. Don't know what's happened to Moses, but we'll make us something that we can worship. On the list of 10 commands that Moses is getting from God, they're about to violate number 1 and number 2. They've lost sight of their leader, and they need something to worship, and so they make it. A little bit later, outside of the book of Exodus, this is all in a relatively short time frame. In Numbers chapter 16, the people, in an event called Korah's Rebellion, the people of God, while being led and fed and protected by God, they begin again to grumble and complain about the way God is directing the affairs of his people. Mercy and grace poured out to them, love and concern and compassion, food and water, they got everything they need, but they complain about how God's taking care of them. Numbers chapter 21, a little bit later, they get a little impatient. God, he's not acting on their time schedule. And so they put God to the test. They put God's patience to the test. Numbers 21, verses 4 through 9. And they say, God has brought us out here again. This is the common refrain. God's brought us out here again with no food, no water. They actually say we hate, we loathe this worthless food that God has given us. God is still providing for them, but they're tired of it. Testing God. And then a little bit later, Numbers chapter 25, God is still providing, directing, caring for his people. In Numbers 25, verses 1 through 9, they decide, we'll just start following other gods. Not that we're totally leaving the God that rescued us and redeemed us. We thank God for that, for our salvation and our rescue and our redemption. We thank God for doing that. But we also like this God. And we like what this system of beliefs gives us. And so it's not that we're really leaving God, it's that we're adding to. Now remember, these people who are doubting God, testing God's patience, grumbling and complaining about God, and going and serving other gods, these are the very people who should have had every reason to trust and obey God. Eyewitnesses to a miracle every morning in manna. They saw Moses strike the rock and water comes out. They realized that God is the one who rescued them out of Egypt. He delivered them from their enslavement, guided them around, led them around, destroyed their enslavers, gave them food and drink all along the way. Their situation, by God's grace and mercy, has changed. They're no longer enslaved in Egypt. They're no longer suffering at the hands of evil dictators. They're no longer just wandering around aimlessly. God's giving them direction. God's providing for them. Their situation has changed by God's grace, but their cravings and their desires haven't. And there's the problem. It's not that they just saw some kind of foreign god, deity, and said, you know what, I think I want to worship that one today. It wasn't just that. It wasn't just that they felt a little hungry and said, is God not going to feed us? It wasn't that they were a little bit thirsty and said, God's not going to give us anything to drink. It's their cravings and their lusts that lead them to idolatry and immorality and grumbling in the face of God's blessings and testing God's patience in the face of his providence. God's acts of grace and mercy in their lives never guaranteed that they were going to live the kind of life that God wanted. That's Exodus. That's the story on into the book of Numbers that Paul is talking about in 1 Corinthians 10. Now, would you turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. There's no way to understand what Paul's doing in 1 Corinthians if you don't understand what the people of God did in the Exodus story. So that's what he's playing on right here. Verse 1, I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the clouds. The cloud was guiding them, providing for them, protecting them. And they all passed through the sea, removed from Egypt, delivered from, redeemed from their enslavements, and passing through the waters to a better life. All were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. They all ate the same spiritual food. They all drank the same spiritual drink. God gave them miracle after miracle after miracle. Still doubted. They drank from the spiritual rock that followed them. The rock was Christ. And nevertheless, with most of them, God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Now, verse 6 is the one we didn't get to yet. In verse 6, he says, now these things took place as examples for us, that we may not desire evil as they did. And then he goes on this list of events that really, parallel what we just read. It was, verse 7, do not be idolaters, as some of them were, as it's written, the people sat down to eat and drink, and they rose up to play. We must not indulge in sexual immorality, as some of them did. 23,000 fell in a day. We must not put Christ to the test, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the serpents, nor grumble, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the destroyer. Verse 11, these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of ages has come. Let's stop right there. And so Paul writes 1 Corinthians 10 in part to explain what was happening to the people in Exodus and Numbers. But not just that, because nobody in Exodus and Numbers is reading what Paul wrote. He writes 1 Corinthians 10 to show the church that what happened to them is also happening to us. What happened to those people also happens to our people. They were under the cloud of God's protection. They passed through the sea, and they were baptized into Moses as they crossed the Red Sea, pledging their allegiance and their loyalty to him, eating the same spiritual food and drink as they kept every day, taking advantage of God's providential care. And so on the surface, if God's delivered them from Egypt, crossed them through the Red Sea, giving them food and drink every day, it would seem that they're good with God. God's mercy and grace has led to their redemption and their deliverance. They're no longer enslaved. They're on their way to a better life. Things are great with them. God is keeping his promises to them. Lots of things have changed for the people of God, but their desires have not. It's those desires, cravings, that kept leading them to miss the kind of life God wants them to live. And so even though God was merciful and gracious to them, verse 5, he was not pleased with the lives they lived in response to that. And so when God gives them over to their lusts and their desires, when God gives them over to their cravings, then they are left to deal with the consequences of their actions. And I can imagine their shock when thinking about their lives and thinking about how they've been blessed by God and God brought them out, and then they get to a point in their life where they complain and they murmur and they grumble, and then God gives them over to their desires, and God gives them over to the consequences of their action. I can imagine their shock. We're the people of God, baptized into Moses in the Red Sea. God brought us out. God's continually giving us his food and his drink. God's actually leading us around here. How in the world have our lives ended up like this? God was still gracious. The problem was not with him, it was them. The people of God had a responsibility to act in line with what God wanted them to do. It was up to them to get their lives in line with God's call. The problem was not with God. He was very gracious, very merciful, very kind, compassionate, loving to them. The problem was with God's people. And Paul writes 1 Corinthians chapter 10 to the church to say the same thing may be true in Corinth. And we have it preserved for us in our Bibles today because God may say the same thing could still be true today in Milan, Tennessee. In 1 Corinthians 10, verse 6 and verse 11, these stories from Exodus and Numbers are examples to us so that we do not repeat their mistakes. Remember Bob Ross's happy little accidents? We learn more from our mistakes maybe than our successes. And our successes, we just go on and don't really change anything in our mistakes, in our failures. We learn what needs to be different. And so what we learn in 1 Corinthians 10 is that the people in Exodus and Numbers, they trusted that because they had been baptized into Moses, that they were good. We're not enslaved to Egypt anymore. We're on the way to a better country, a better land. We're free from our enslavements. And I can understand how we could say that because we've been baptized into Christ, we are right with God no matter what. Paul, of course, we said this last week, Paul assumes that all of his readers have been baptized into Christ. He says that in chapter 1. He alludes to it here. He just assumes that everybody that's reading this letter has been baptized into Christ. And so they were rescued and saved and delivered. Sins were washed away. Blood was contacted. Remission of sins happened. Washed away. All that happened, right? But if we think that that's all that needs to happen, and then we're right with God for the rest of our lives, Paul says we need to learn a little bit. Yes, it is at that point where we're rescued, saved, delivered, redeemed. But just as those Old Testament folks passed through the Red Sea and died to the life of slavery they'd been living in Egypt, when we pass through the waters, we should die to the kind of life we had been living before. Selfish cravings and desires should die. But it's pretty clear that the Corinthians had brought their selfish desires and their cravings right through the waters of baptism, and they weren't doing a whole lot to deny them or to kill them. They were not baptized into a church or a religious group, a sect, a denomination, or anything like that. They were baptized into Christ. And if they were baptized into Christ, it was to Jesus that they had pledged their allegiance. It's to Him that they were saying, through that, we will be loyal to Him. It's not that He just washes our sins away and then leaves us alone until heaven. It's that we have a Lord, a higher loyalty in this life. But the lives of the Corinthians were still fueled by their own desires and their cravings. And Paul said, let those Old Testament folks be an example to you. Can't do that. Just like Israel constantly ate the food and drink that God gave them, but they didn't appreciate it, and they grumbled and complained about God. The Corinthian church, they're eating the Lord's Supper every week, probably remembering the sacrifice of Jesus, but if you read the letter, they're not living a life of sacrifice. They'll partake God's goodness. They'll take the meal. And they want the benefits of the sacrifice, but their desires and their cravings have not changed. Yes, they're baptized into Christ. Yes, they partake of the Lord's Supper every week. But they're still living the same old life. And so Paul warns them in 1 Corinthians 10 about the dangers of living that kind of life. And if we have the attitude today that says, you know, the way that I live my life, it doesn't really matter. Because in March 19 whatever, 2000 whatever, I was baptized into Christ. My sins were washed away. I'm going to heaven. Doesn't really matter what I do. If that's my attitude, then what Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 10 is for us. If the attitude is, as long as I'm baptized into Christ and I partake of the Lord's Supper every week, that it doesn't really matter what else I do. I went to church, I'm good, and I'm going to do it again next week, and so I'm good with God. If that's the attitude that we've got, and I don't know if it's your mindset, I don't think it is, but I know it's possible, then we are the people that Paul writes to and for in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Because here's what he says. To people who are obviously thinking, just like those folks in Exodus and Numbers, we were passed through the waters. We were baptized into Christ. Sins were washed away, blood contacted, remission of sins happened, added to the church. Now I'm a Christian. Show up and take the Lord's Supper once a week. and I'm good. It's to that mindset that doesn't think life has to change that Paul says in verse 12, let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall. Let him who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall. And what Paul means by that is not just look at your actions and your behaviors. I can change my actions and my behaviors pretty easy. I can show up. I can take communion. I can change my actions and behaviors. But the focus of 1 Corinthians chapter 10 is not about action and behavior. It's about attitudes. It's about desires. And it's about cravings. Because when you think about it, a lot of things did change from Exodus 1 to Exodus 13. Before the people started receiving the blessings of God, a lot of things changed. Situationally, and they were different. Not enslaved anymore, freed from their enslavement, crossed through the waters, delivered, redeemed. When you think about all those examples we talked about, led by God, provided for by God, food and water that God gives them to drink, all the blessings they needed, their shoes didn't wear out, things are good with them. Everything had changed except their desires, their cravings. And because of their desires and their cravings, their lives really didn't change much. So over and over and over again, they keep falling back into the idolatry, the immorality, the sexual immorality, the grumbling and complaining, and the testing of God's patience. For us, yes, when we're baptized into Christ, something changes. Added to the family of God, the body of believers, member of the church, sins washed away, something changes. When we partake of the Lord's Supper each week, something changes. But unless our desires and our cravings change, not much else does. At the end of the day, you and I are pretty good about doing what we want to do. When you look at the people that Jesus interacted with in his life, and they would come to him, and when Jesus would ask them questions, and this is true with some of the first people that he called to be his disciples, some of his apostles, people who came to him for healing. I don't know of a time where Jesus looked at somebody who came to him for something and said, well, tell me what you believe about this. Tell me what your doctrine is on that. I don't know of a time where Jesus ever asked somebody, tell me what you know about this particular biblical doctrine. He doesn't do that. Jesus asks people questions like, who do you love? Where's your heart? When people come to him, one of his most often questions deals with, what do you want? That's the question Jesus centers on. And he'll phrase it in different ways. Do you love me? What do you love? But he's asking, what do you desire? What do you crave? What do you want? And he asks that question because he knows that whatever we want is typically what we will end up doing. And so this morning, what is it that you really desire? What is it that you crave? When it really comes down to it, what do you really want? Think about it. I'm not going to fill in the blank. This is open-ended. What do you want? You woke up this morning thinking about something you wanted. What was it? You went to bed last night thinking about something that you desire, something you crave. What was it? Today, at some point, you know what your cravings and your desires are. Theirs are going to hit again. What are they? And are they cravings and desires that lead us closer to Jesus? Or do those cravings and those desires, what we want, do they lead us farther away from him? That's the question. Jesus doesn't ask, what do you know? What do you believe? His most common question seems to center on, what do you want? In the people we read about in Exodus and Numbers, they wanted salvation. They wanted redemption, yes. They wanted to be free from their enslavements, yes. But by their actions, it doesn't seem like they really wanted to be the kind of people that God wanted them to be. Why else would they pursue sexually immoral things and idolatry? Why else would they put God to the test and grumble about him every chance they got and decide, we'll kill Moses and go back to Egypt? Could it be that they just did not crave being the kind of people God wanted them to be? Today, if we are the kind of people, and again, I don't think this is your mindset. I hope it's not, but I know it's possible. If we are the kind of people who say, I was baptized into Christ, sins were washed away, take the Lord's Supper every week, don't really need to deal with any other kind of issues that I've got in my life. Now, we would never say that in those words, but we may live that way. We wouldn't say it, wouldn't admit it, but we may live that way. Could it be that we really just don't want to be the kind of people God wants us to be? Could it be that we just don't crave to be more and more like Jesus? And so this morning, I don't know where that finds you. I don't know where that hits you. I don't know if you're the kind of person who has that mindset or not. But I do want to leave you with the question of, what do you want? Is it to be more and more like Jesus? And if it is, then we can work with that. Because if you're here today and you want to be more and more like Jesus, I think we can figure out how to follow his steps. We can figure out how to be a disciple of his. You could be here this morning and you are ready to be baptized into Christ. You recognize you want to follow him. You crave being like him. And so you want to follow him through the waters of baptism where your sins are washed away and something changes there. Sins are gone, added to the body of believers, become a member of God's people, family of God, children of God. That happens there. That's the start. That's not the end. But maybe that's what you're ready for today. Or it could be that you're here today and you realize that you kind of have that mindset of, I need to be baptized so I don't go to hell. And I want to go to heaven, but nothing really changes in the meantime. And so maybe today that's what you need. To decide that your desires have gotten you off track, and you need to cultivate better desires, better cravings in your life. We can work with that too, if you want. Maybe there's some things happening in your life, some ways that we can be praying for you and for your family and whatever's coming down the line for you and for yours. If that's what you want, then we can do that. I don't know what your mindset is. I don't know what your desires are. I don't know where your cravings lead you. I don't know what keeps getting you down. But if you want to follow Jesus, if you want to be a disciple of Christ, then we can work with that. If you have any need, any response that you want to make to this sermon or to anything that's on your mind right now, we always invite you to come make that call while together we stand and while we sing.